back up with in chapter 15 the two possibilities that we have that we're looking at. We looked at the first possibility of the two possibilities, are finished up with that last week. Looked at the first of two, in which the Israelites had 3,000 men that were coming to essentially bind up Samson to take him down to the Philistines because the Philistines had told the Israelites to go do so. 3,000 of those men came, of course, this is after all the chaos that happened at Samson's wedding. And him setting foxes loose with firebrands on their tails and then run around and burn up all the crops in Philistine at the time. So we got down to verse 13 last week. 3,000 Israelites handed over Samson to the Philistines. And if you remember, 3,000 men sent to tie up one. Samson asked them, hey, I'll go with you as long as you don't try to kill me or come against me in any way. I will go essentially peacefully. Okay? And that is where we finished up last week. So 3,000 soldiers have now bound, I guess, or tied up Samson, and they are taking him to the Philistines to turn him over and give custody of him to the Philistines. And that is where we will pick up with in verse number 14. Okay, so if you look at verse 13, we see them actually binding him, and they spake unto him, saying, no. That's when he asked they're going to kill him. No, but we will bind thee fast and deliver thee into their hand. Be surely we will not kill thee. If they bound him with two new cords and brought him up from the rock. Okay, so his hands are tied up, taking him over to turn him over to the Philistines. Okay? And we see now God heaped up 1,000 Philistines. So we now see Samson bound, giving over custody of the Philistines. We can see what takes place next. Now, once in custody here of the Philistines, right? So prisoner exchange, right? Or whatever. We're just turning this guy over, turning Samson over to the Philistines. We see once again Samson exhibiting some amazing strength. Okay, and there were some events that took place that we're going to see here in verses 14 and 15 that happened when once again the Spirit of the Lord has coming over Samson. Okay, and when he came into Lehi, verse 14, chapter 15, the Philistines shouted against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and put forth his hand, and took it, and slew 1,000 men therewith. Samson is turned over to the Philistines. The Philistines, I'm sure, as they're bringing, the Israelites are bringing Samson down. I'm sure they're hollering stuff at him. You know, in case of, got you caught, dirty dog, caught him every name in the book, burn up the crops, finally got you. So you can imagine kind of the fever pitch of a situation that Samson is in. We see now that once he gets over into the Philistines' custody, much like a superhero movie that we can see and watch now, probably even more so, Samson exhibits this superhuman strength when the Spirit of the Lord kind of washes over him. And we see that he snaps the ropes that were bound around him, which in its own right would have been a fairly difficult thing. We know these are new cords, which would have been ropes that were made up of fairly new ropes. It wouldn't have been like, how to liken this in the best way that I can. If you're throwing hay or baling hay, the cords that, or the string that's around that, it's pretty strong stuff, right? And you can't, a lot of times it's hard to just take that and just snap it with your hands. Now, Pastor Rob in his heyday of farming, I'm sure, could just snap that string with no problem. But the string is very, very strong. It's very sturdy because, you know, it holds all that tight, compressed hay. A new cord, of course, as that hay sits in the barn, right, that string that's around that begins to wither and gets older and older, and the hay that's been in the barn for a year, right? That cord is nowhere near as strong as the hay when it first comes out of the baler, right? So this would have been, to put this simply as possible, this would have been like freshly baled cord that would have been very thick, thicker than a regular hay bale cord, made out of whatever it was, whatever vine or thing they were making it out of. This would have been very, very almost impossible to just snap or tear loose with your hands, let alone being kind of tied up with it, as you would think, probably around his chest, around his shoulders, around his arms, probably even his hands behind, having tied up kind of all the way around so he couldn't get loose. Okay. And it's hard enough to break something like, for example, if I had that rope and I was able to wrap my hands around both sides of that rope and hold it and get good leverage on it, I'm going to be able to snap it faster as if I had my hands together like this and it tight on the outside, right? It's going to be easier for me to pull something apart than it is to kind of move my hands and kind of bust it apart like that, right? That's kind of how he is here. So he's all kind of wrapped up, and we see him, I would imagine, much like a movie. Those cords just kind of start popping off of him as he's able to be overcome with all this strength. And then in the midst of him breaking through these cords, obviously there's been a donkey that's been dead not very long or somewhere close to him, because he picks up the fresh jawbone of a donkey that we see. Now, we don't see... There's a legitimate possibility here that there was a donkey standing, and Samson reached over and grabbed its jawbone and killed it. That could have happened, right? He may have walked over, and the closest thing to him when he busted out of those cords was this donkey. He just reached over and grabbed its jawbone and jerks it off out of it, and that's what he uses to kill his Philistines. It's a possibility. We know that it's there close, or maybe they had recently killed one, or maybe one had died in the process. Whatever the case may have been, I think it loses here that I don't think there was just like this little jawbone that was just laying on the ground for Samson, and he probably walked over to this dead animal or something that hadn't been dead very long and was able to kind of rip this thing off in the process of having all these people around. This was very movie scene-ish, comic book scene-ish thing that was taking place here when he picks up the jawbone, and then not only does he do all these amazing things, one man proceeds to kill 1,000 Philistines. It's pretty unbelievable, really, if you kind of think about it. Even with the other things that Samson have done, which have been pretty cool, right? He's done some pretty amazing things. Being able to bust out of these cords, get a hold of this jawbone in whatever the capacity he was able to get a hold of it, and then proceed to use it to kill 1,000 men is pretty wild. It's pretty unbelievable feat. And so much though that he kind of writes a poem about it, or says a poem, or speaks a poem. With the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps. With the jaw of an ass, have I slain 1,000 men. So. Very much like God promised it was going to happen over in Joshua, like these things were going to take place. We've seen that numerous times now. This is exactly what's happened here when Samson busts out of his ropes, busts out of his bonds, picks up the jawbone, kills 1,000 people, probably very quickly. You kind of think about just how long it would take if you had 1,000 people just lined up, how long it would take you just to walk by those 1,000 people. Now you got 1,000 people converging on one man, and he's just got one jawbone, and it's just, I don't know, it's kind of, if you can just visualize what this looks like. Probably can't even, in visualization of it, really be able to figure out exactly just what this would have looked like when Samson was doing this. And the fact that the jawbone never broke in the process of this, right? And he's killing 1,000 people. The fact that it never broke or never cracked or never severed. I mean, maybe it did. Maybe it hit 2 pieces of it and was just hacked. Who knows what was going on here? But it's a pretty wild idea, pretty wild scene to kind of see in your brain. Okay. Unfortunately, though, as amazing as this is, because it is, as absolutely as amazing as this is, Samson again shows absolutely no regard for the instruction of God, right? Picking up the donkey's jawbone to use as a weapon, picking up at all, was a direct violation of his vow as a Nazirite. Right, it's something that he should not have done. We saw that vow of the Nazirites back over in chapter 13. And again, we've seen him break this vow numerous times. We see no regard for this at all. Now, if the Spirit of the Lord came over Samson and allowed him to break out of these cords, does Samson not probably realize that God was also going to allow him to defeat his enemy in the way in which God wanted him to? But again, no regard here for the instructions of God. He does essentially what he wants to do. Verse 17, and it came to pass when he made an end speaking that he cast away the jawbone out of his hand, and calleth the place Ramathoyah. Verse 18, and he was sore athirst, and called on the Lord, and said, Thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die of thirst, and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised. So after this slaying of 1,000 men, Samson probably, bloody and all the stuff hanging off of him, picks the jawbone and just chucks it as far as he can throw it, which is probably a long ways, because he's just probably pretty strong here. And he experiences extreme thirst. Okay, which makes sense, right? If you go through using your hands, essentially swinging a jawbone around to kill 1,000 people, it makes total sense that Samson is thirsty when he is done. What does God demonstrate? Okay, specifically in verse 18, there's a reason this is here. Okay, there's a reason this verse is here. What does God demonstrate to Samson by causing him to be so thirsty? Why does Samson become so athirst here after he has done this? What is this? What is God trying to do? Remind him, right, that all of the things that Samson was doing was because God allowed him to do it. Okay? Do you think 500 people in, Samson was probably laboring and probably sweating a little bit? Maybe, maybe not, right? We don't see any other mention of when the Spirit of God comes over him, we never see him having what I would call a natural consequence of physical exertion. Okay? Usually when you're out working and sweating, you get thirsty. Okay, that's kind of a natural consequence of physical exertion. We've not seen Samson deal with that any other time. Okay, any other time we've seen the Spirit of God come over Samson, he's never had an experience afterwards where he's really been worn out. This is Samson. This is God reminding Samson that, hey, you just killed 1,000 people, but I'm the one that allowed that to happen. I'm still in charge here. You don't have anything without the strength that you have comes from God, right? And your life is still yet in God's hand. And this was obviously Samson had never experienced this type of thirst before, because it gets to a point that he thinks in verse 18, called on the Lord, you've given me this great deliverance, right? You've allowed me to kill 1,000 people, and now I'm going to die of thirst, right? So this would have been extreme thirst that came over Samson. It was a way in which God reminded him where his strength comes from. And finally, right, this is the first time now we've seen this. What does Samson do? Praise to God, right? Reaches out to God. We haven't seen that yet. We've seen Samson do all these things, but we've never seen him ask or pray God anything. So finally now we see Samson acknowledging that God is giving him the victory and that he's now in a weakened condition. God graciously and miraculously here is going to provide water from a place in Lehi. Verse 19, but God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw, and there came water thereout. And when he had drunk, his spirit came again, and he revived. And wherefore he called the name Echhakor, which is in Lehi unto this day. So God allows water to come from where? The very jaw that he used, right? The hollow of the jaw that he used to kill the people, kill all the 1,000 Philistines. So God then provides for his thirst in a pretty miraculous, this is a very miraculous thing that took place, right? This is very unusual. This wasn't happen naturally, but he clave a hollow place that was in the jaw, and water came out, and then once he has, I guess, quenched his thirst, he revived kind of, and then named it in Hekor, which is in Lehi unto this day. And then finishing up there in verse 20, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years. Okay, so Samson's 20-year judgeship is mentioned after the slaughter of 1,000 Philistines. Okay, so presumably the 20 years that followed Samson's initial conflict with the Philistines. All right, so we've seen the initial conflict with the Philistines. This is probably 20 years now. That's probably followed after we saw the initial thing kind of coming in. That's how long he judged for Israel in the Philistines' land. Verse or chapter 16. Go ahead, Chad. All right, chapter 16 now gets us into two plans as we move more into Samson's eye problem here. Now, Samson just killed 1,000 Philistines that we've seen, and even after his 20-year reign as a judge, Samson is still wanted by the Philistines kind of towards the back end here of his judgeship. All right, so let's read the first two verses of chapter 16, and then we can kind of get to more of this story, maybe a little more, I guess, famous part of this story. Of course, I guess the whole story is pretty famous. Then went Samson to Gaza, and saw there a harlot, and went in unto her. And it was told the Gazites, saying, Samson is come hither, and they passed him in, and laid wait for him all night in the gate of the city, and were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it is day, we shall kill him. Okay, so 20 years here at the end of his, or coming to the end of his judgeship, we still see the Philistines trying to attack Samson. So Samson goes to Gaza, which would have been another of one of the 5 major cities that the Philistine cities. This one was located 30 miles from his home. Okay, so he may not have gone there specifically for the purpose of visiting a harlot, but while he was there, he saw a harlot and indulged, of course, in lust and in immorality. Okay, we see that there in verse number 1. Now, knowing Samson is in town, so obviously Samson's reputation here going to precede him. At this point in his judgeship, people know who Samson is, know what he's done, know his war against the Philistines, know the abilities that he has. A pretty famous guy here. So when he shows up into your city, people know that Samson's there. So the Philistines know that Samson is now in Gaza, and they come up with the plan to kill him in the morning by posting up guards by the city gates. Now, we know, of course, the story. Of course, the attack would be a surprise attack. If they had any hope to succeed, if they knew he was coming, if Samson knew he was coming, the Philistines knew there'd be no chance. They were trying to set up, waiting on him to leave. So they posted up guards at their gates to capture and kill Samson after he's done spending the night in Gaza. Now I'll get to verse number 3. And Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is before Hebron. So Samson now wakes up at midnight. Okay, and then he comes up with his own plan. Now, this was obviously divine intervention here, that he realized that these Philistines were waiting on him, maybe he expected the Philistines to lay in wait for him. Whatever the case may be, Samson comes up with his own plan here. So he wakes up at midnight when everybody else, of course, everybody else would be asleep. walks up to the gate of the city. Now, we know how these old ancient cities were built, right? Walls all the way around the city, fortification on top of the walls, and most of the time only one way in and one way out, right? That was the way they could seclude and fortify the city the best. There would be big gate, big door at the beginning of the walls. They would open it up during the day. People would come in and out. The trade would happen. A lot of cities, you'd have your court going on right there outside the city gates, or within, right inside the city gates. You have people judging people for the crimes and things they had committed. There have been guards posted up at the gates, and in my mind, I see two big, huge doors right on these gate posts, and then you had soldiers over there to crank these big wheels. That's how they would open up and close these big, huge doors. Okay, if it's midnight, obviously the doors to the city are what? Closed up, right? They are shut, so nobody can come in and leave. Samson wants to leave, so we see him walking up to the gate of the city and picking the two posts out of the ground. Okay, now this isn't like me pulling T-post out of my garden, which is hard enough, all right, at the time, they were driven in far enough. These would have been massive posts, been probably at least 18 to 20 feet tall, right? And that's probably a small estimation. Huge, massive posts that would have been driven way far down into the ground, because that door had to be heavily fortified, right? Because they bust the door down, they can get into the city. So this would have been massive tree-like posts that were holding this door. He walks over, they would have been way down into the ground. He walks over and tears out the two posts. And if you look at verse number 3, I chuckled as I was kind of looking over this, but he took the door of the city, the two posts, and this is the bar and all. Samson just picked everything up, right? The big, huge bar they've slapped over top of the door to lock it, the bar that was holding the door together, the outer frame together, the huge, massive, he just picks the whole thing up. Now, Samson, this thing would have been wide enough, right? He probably couldn't just reached over. I'm sure Samson had a pretty good wingspan, but this area of the door would have at least, right? Most estimations of ancient cities, these doors were at least 10 feet on each side, so it was a 20-foot plate. And that's a smaller estimation. He walked over and just picks the whole thing up on the shoulder, right? Just flaps it up on his shoulder and walks up out of the hill with it. That's how he leaves the city. Puts them up on his shoulder and carried them up to the top of the hill that is before Hebron. Now, I imagine, okay, this is a 100% Atlanteism, okay? This is just how I see this in my head. We know there was guards posted up on top of the walls. I think there was probably a 24-hour watch there, right? That would make the most sense. They had probably ran in shifts, either 8 or 10 or 12-hour shifts. These guys were trained to be the archers on top of the walls, trained to look out anything coming. They probably had outposts, other places that knew danger was coming. These guys would have been very well trained in protecting that door, and there's probably been multiple of them. I would imagine there's probably torches that were on top of the wall where they could at least see the local area around them. I'm sure by midnight, the 8, 10, 12 of them, were talking, carrying on. It was a calm night, normal night like always, and then everything just starts to shake, and there's banging and clanging, and all this stuff's going on, and they're up, looking around, can't figure it out, and they look down over the wall, right? I hate to keep using him, but I think it's a crazy thing. Here stands Landon carrying this door of this gate of this city, just walking with it on his shoulders and probably waving at the guys as he walks up the hill. And they don't know what to do, and they're all kind of clamoring around. That's what just took place here. Okay? He rips this thing completely out of the ground and off the wall, and that's how he leaves. So God here now removes Gaza's gatepost. All right? How embarrassing it had to have been here for the Philistines. This is one of the 5 major cities. very, very well fortified. How embarrassing it had to have been, because now not only is the guy they're trying to capture and kill gone, but the city now is very, very much defenseless until they can get the gate rebuilt. And it would have probably taken some time to find the posts that were big enough and to refix the doors and make sure everything fit into the frame and do all the damage, repair all the damage that took place. So this would have been a pretty embarrassing thing to have happened. Okay? Go ahead, Jack. That brings us now to verse number 4. Keep going. And one more time. And that brings us now to 2 pinnacles. Now, this is the end of this story. Okay? As we move through chapter 16, and it has 2 pinnacles, or two kind of climaxes to the story, okay, that this builds to. And we're going to start to see the beginning of this in verse number 4. Now, the heading in my Bible, it's on my iPad. It usually gives me headings when new things start. Chapter 4, or verse number 4, and all the verses that come below it, the rest of the chapter 16, just in big, bold letters above chapter 4, or section 4, or verse 4, it just says Delilah. Okay, to let us know that, okay, here's a new character, and she's going to be involved now in this story in some way. And we know here Samson once again is going to fall in love. It's been 20 years or so since his first wife had been killed, burned at the stake, not burned at the stake, but burned in her house. And so he falls in love again, and this time it's with more famously known Samson's wife, Delilah. And he's now going to be involved with her over a period of time. Though he never marries her, okay? And there's kind of an illicit love story here that places his moral weakness in stark contrast to his spirit-endowed physical strengths, okay? So we're going to kind of see that take place again as we move through chapter 16. Now, the lords of the 5 major cities asked Delilah to learn the secret to Samson's strength. Okay? And they each promised her a payout if they can figure out the secret to her strength. So, and it came to pass, verse 4, afterward, that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up unto her, and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth, and by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and we will give thee every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. Okay, so they want to figure out why Samson has the superhuman strength that he does. Okay, now I don't have time to get through the rest of this today. I don't want to have to cut it off in between the middle of it. So we're going to stop a little early today. But next week we're going to finish up here this story with Samson and Delilah, and then ultimately what Samson becomes humbled because of his disobedience. And then we see a bit of a redemption story for Samson as he realizes the error of his ways, and he finds ways to eventually destroy all of the Philistines in one of the greatest going out scenes of all human history. And we'll get into that next week. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this story of Samson and being able to see how you continue to use him to do exactly as you say that you were going to do, even though Samson not always, most of the time, not looking towards you or asking you for any advice or seeking your face at all. You still managed to use him to carry out your wishes, Lord. And in the end, though, ultimately, Samson is because of his disobedience, the Lord falls to some folly of his own. So we pray as we finish this up next week and continue to look through the book of Judges here, and as we move into Ruth, too, Lord, you just continue to be with us and teach us, Lord, from your word. Pray for Pastor Rob, Lord, as he comes here in the next few minutes as well, that you'll keep us attentive to the words you'd have for us through him this morning as well. In your name I pray. Amen.